So let's talk through every single army in Warhammer 40k and give a rough overview as to how they play in-game. Jumping straight in, let's start with the armies of the Imperium and the poster boys in the Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes typically play as elite power armoured infantry, often specialising in shock tactics and aggression over defence, though perhaps being the flagship faction with quite such a massive miniature range and so many chapters in their backstory. Playstyles for the Space Marines are very diverse. Chapters have huge differences in their ways of making war. Both ranged and melee armies, jump packs, terminators, heavy tank or dreadnought gun lines, there's lots of choice out there. Typically though it's mostly elite and kind of generalist. Even your heavy weapon gun line Space Marines are going to put up some sort of a fight in melee. The Space Marine army rule is the Oath of Moment. This allows you to mark one enemy unit in your command phase and your entire army gets to reroll hits against that, allows you to put out some pinpoint damage output on the unit that's bothering you the most. It can be really big in range or melee, but it's perhaps particularly nice if you want to focus down one big enemy target with a whole gun line of Space Marines. Supporting that, all the Space Marines get access to Armour of Contempt as a stratagem, one command points to worsen enemy AP and keep that power armour sturdy. And then to represent their different archetypes of war, they've got more choice than just about any other army out there. You get to choose special options depending on what chapter you go for, plus 7 different detachments from the core codex and a few more outside for the divergent chapters. I'll cover the many different ways of Space Marines making war at the end of the Imperium section. For a few key units, you've got the Space Marine Intercessors, your standard guys with bolters holding the battle line. They can mark objectives for the objective secured type rule, meaning that even if you move away from them or your unit gets shot down, it remains under your control until the opponent can take them. One punchy damage dealer unit are the Aggressors. They might be slightly pricey in points, slow and short range, but with their Boltstorm gauntlets and Power Fists, they have enormous damage. They can be one of the best units to build around with detachment combos and good stratagems. Perhaps to get them into battle, you might want a Land Raider. The Land Raider Redeemer is a particularly potent version of them. You can move it, drop a unit out the front, and they can still charge, and then they can absolutely tow something with those Flamestorm cannons, potentially on Overwatch as well in the enemy turn. For a nice objective support unit, we've got the Infiltrators, which make a common appearance in plenty of competitive armies. These sneaky Phobos Space Marines can deny reserves to 12 inches, so if you put them on an objective, then the enemy can't deep strike next to you, which is nice. Very good for holding the home field, though they can infiltrate as per their name. And finally, for a bit of armoured might, here we have the Redemptor Dreadnought, a really big and tough armoured sarcophagus with a 2+ armour save and a -1 damage rule, capable of putting the smack down both at range and melee. A hard unit to go too far wrong with, and particularly nice in Ironstorm Spearhead. Overall, Space Marines are characterised by good armour elite troops, and an absolutely vast array of options with chapters, detachments and unit choices. Despite this, the core codex Space Marines aren't really doing that well at the moment, 42% win rates, though that is likely due in no small parts due to the divergent chapters being a little bit of a stronger way to run standard Space Marines, basically getting access to the same sort of options, but getting additional unit choice and detachment access on top of that, so generally tend to be directly superior right now. Core codex Space Marines can still put up a fight though. Gladius, Ironstorm, Vanguard and Firestorm can all be good army lists. For the cyborg body horror soldiers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the forces of the machine god tend to prefer a ranged warfare more so than melee. Classically, they're reasonably focused on medium and light infantry, fighting alongside some bizarre and arcane war machine support. Currently, they may be a little bit more focused on messing with enemy movement and a kind of low damage output as an army, their units being maybe a little bit more cheap and low threat than AdMech players would like. Their army rule is the Doctrine or Imperatives, the tech priest programming your Skitarii troops and servitors with how to fight. You can go either Protector or Conqueror, depending on whether or not you want to move fast and punish the enemy in their own deployment zone, or get heavier firepower, stay still and get extra defense in yours. Not everything in the army has it, and it doesn't do too much for close combat troops though. Otherwise, for themes of the army, units tend to be empowered by fighting alongside their battle line units. Having some Skitarii nearby can be big, perhaps particularly for things like Cataphrone Breachers that get big hit rerolls and damage boosts from being near some Vanguard. The machine-augmented parts of the army give them some good invulnerable saves pretty much across the faction, so a good chance to bounce any one piece of damage. And they do have a codex with plenty of detachment options, things like radiation bombardments in their Rad Zone core, or sneaky Skitarii tricks in the Hunter cohort, with options like infiltrating, move, shoot, move, and hiding units from being shot at long range. For some key units, we have the Skitarii Vanguard, 80 points per 10, and generally put some good control on objectives. They're often seen jumping out of their hovercraft Dune Riders to take the midfield. One of the best damage dealers of the faction are the Cataphron Breachers, servitors with their legs replaced by a track unit, and their arc rifles are very dangerous to heavy infantry and vehicles alike. The Chicken Walkers of the Iron Strider Ballistari and the Dragoons can be quite scary. Cheap and tough walkers that are quite fast and have some okay firepower, hard to go too far wrong with them, and very good for holding up and disrupting the enemy. And for one leader example, we've got the Tech Priest Dominus. He could be running with the Cataphron Breachers for a 5+ Feel No Pain for really quite a tanky unit, though he could also use his brother Tech Priest, the Manipulus, for lethal hits for the unit, and he can give them one nice turn of 4+ invulnerable saves as well. Currently, the Admech are also on the lower end of the Warhammer 40k power spectrum, a win rate of around about 44% at tournaments. There are definitely some units that are a bit overcosted, such as Rust Stalkers and the Castellan robots. Fingers crossed Games Workshop might give them a little bit of help in a future balance pass. For the standard humans that the Imperium hasn't turned into cyborgs, we've got the Astra Militarum, the hard-bitten troops of the Imperial Guard and the Emperor's main fighting force. They're normal humans fighting against a galaxy of horrors with little more than a las gun, maybe backed up by some heavy tanks and artillery. They generally tend to be more range-focused than melee on the whole, with rules to support as such. It's generally the infantry's job to take the objectives and hold the line, usually while the tanks deliver the main punch of damage with a bit of artillery to support and take down key targets. You can play with them in several different ways, including Horde Guard, Mechanized Guard, or Armoured Company, and there's even the Tempestus Scions as a bit of a sub-army with elite stormtroopers that can drop in from the sky. In 10th edition, their major army mechanic are their orders. There's a list of 6 of them that can be given by various officers. Really interesting and powerful options such as moving faster, getting better at shooting or taking cover against enemy firepower, and maintaining the command structure and choosing the right ones at the right time can be the difference between victory and defeat. Otherwise, their detachment rule is Born Soldiers, allowing you to get lethal hits if you're static, which is quite nice for artillery in particular. Lots of indirect fire and stacking shooting boosts, such as Fields of Fire, could really allow you to lay some hurt down on enemies hiding in cover. And the reinforcement stratagem is perhaps a particularly notable one, 2 command points to just return 1 regiment unit to the board, whether it's a big squad of sentinels, 20 guardsmen, or some Kazakin or something. For key units of the guard, there's various flavours of infantry squad. All have their pros and cons and can be one good way to take the midfield objectives. They have lots of objective control and you do get quite a lot of bodies for the points. There's lots of different flavours of Leman Russ Battle Tank, which are often one of the army's primary damage dealers. Between these and the Rogue All Dawns, you can put a lot of armour on the table with high toughness and 2+ saves that some enemy armies really struggle to crack. Perhaps the Demolisher Cannon is a particularly popular choice, just with some enormous anti-tank firepower within 24-inch range, can be quite nice with a tank commander as well. For an example of the artillery, the Basilisk is rather nice. A bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 shooting can really punish enemy Space Marines trying to hide away on objectives, plus you get to slow down units with -2 to move, advance and charge. Just handing out that movement debuff could be really game changing. The Guard do have access to some auxiliary type units as well. The Bulgarin in particular are a very tanky melee unit. Their shields can give them invulnerable saves, and they get -1 damage as their core rule, and they're exactly what you want to have skirmishing over the frontline objectives with the foe. Finally, for the overall faction commander, Lord Solar Leontus is pretty much the god of orders, a very easy pick in most competitive lists at the moment, generating you extra command points to throw at fields of fire or reinforcements, plus can drop orders on unusual targets such as tanks, super heavies or auxilia. Definitely a useful fancy horseman to have around. Power-wise at the moment, the Astra Militarum might have a slightly lower win rate of around about 46%, but they still seem to be an army that some people do really well with. They have won some grand tournaments over the past few months, maybe an army that the average player is struggling with somewhat, but absolute faction experts can take to the highest level if they play things perfectly. Next up we have the Demon Hunters with the Grey Knights. The Knights of Titan operate quite unusually in Warhammer 40k, being a very teleport-heavy army. Their gameplay these days seems to be warping on and off the board with hyper-elite infantry, shooting people with storm bolters and things at close range, and then attacking enemy elites with force weapons and dread knights in close combat. They get quite good armor saves with that true silver armor, most of the factions saving on a 2+. To represent their teleporting, their core rule is Teleport Assault. You get to return a certain amount of units to reserve at the end of each enemy turn. and then those units can deep strike back onto the board. So you can basically warp your units around to make sure that they're somewhere relevant and pushing the attack on enemies that really don't want to get hit from reserve by a whole load of scary Grey Knights. Their stats are kind of balanced around this though, and I feel like they are lacking some damage as a result of being able to apply their units exactly where needed. Good screening and being at the mercy of long charges can also be an issue for them. Otherwise, for impactful things from their codex, they've got some other good movement stratagems. An option to teleport one unit just 3 inches from the foe, which is very scary. Mist of Deimos to be removing units and putting them back in reserve. And their teleport shunt detachment rule can make Dread Knights very fast indeed, zooming up the board to hit the foe with heavy firepower and quality melee. For some key units, their Brotherhood Terminator unit is an elite anvil of a squad. Tanky Terminators that make good retinues for their characters. Lethal hits on the charge helps them out against heavies a fair bit, and they've got another helpful thing as an apothecary in a unit, resurrecting Terminators from the grave should they fall. The Nemesis Dread Knight started out the edition on really quite a bad note, but following Games Workshop improving both their melee and their side cannon shooting, they are actually able to go toe-to-toe with enemy vehicles now, and lists often tend to include a fair few of these baby carriers to make sure that the army can handle the enemy's toughest stuff. As mentioned, the detachment rule keeps them really quite fast. They get to advance, shoot and charge. The Strike Squad are your battle line Grey Knights that are good for holding objectives. Like the Intercessors for the Space Marines, they can mark objectives to remain yours even if you move away from them, perhaps particularly nice for such a movement heavy army. Their damage output can certainly mess with enemy elites on a big way as well. And finally, Caldor Drago is the commander of the faction, the Supreme Grandmaster lost in the warp, can lead a Terminator squad into the heart of the enemy, deep striking down, getting a big 3-inch charge, and then hitting extra hard with that damage 3 Titan sword when he gets there. Overall, after a rocky start to the edition, the Grey Knights are doing rather well right now, around about 51% wins. Certainly an army with some big choices to make though. I feel like there can be huge differences between a Grey Knight army played super well and a bit more simplistically. You're going to have some big choices and decisions to make with where you put your units on the board. The movement shenanigans can be really powerful, but will only get you so far. For the faithful of the Emperor, we have the Adepta Sororitas. The nuns with guns typically tend to fight as a well-equipped, low-toughness elite infantry army. Sister squads with power armor for a 3+ save, often operating out of transports like rhinos or immolators, and tending to try and destroy the foe with close-range firepower, things like melter weapons and flamers. Their core rule is the Axe of Faith. You generate miracle dice each turn, and also if units get destroyed, rolling a dice and adding it to your pool. You then keep that number and can feed that dice into future dice rolls if it makes sense. Really being big if you've got some 6s on hand, you could get flat damage 6 out of a multi-melter if you want, or push through some automatic saves or hit some wounds, or be helpful for charges. Their detachment rule at the moment is the Hallowed Martyrs. This one gives you damage boosts as your unit take casualties, and if there's just a few sisters left then they could get +1 to hit and wound. It's a bit opponent dependent to be obliging enough to trigger that, but can be quite big when it matters. There's also a fair few 6+ invulnerable saves going around for the units. Their faith in the Emperor may be leading to some slightly miraculous saving throws when they most need it. For a few key units, most armies have at least some battle sisters. They can generate more miracle dice from standing on objectives, and are quite a good place to spend miracle dice on the multi-melters in the unit. The Simulacrum Imperialis can help with that, and can be quite nice to have your line infantry just be able to massively threaten enemies' tanks with the support of some miraculous help. Immolators can help split the squad in two as well, which is nice. Can be good to have an aggressive section go up the board in one of those, while the rest of the sisters cover the home objective. Morven Val, the faction leader, backed up by Paragon Warsuits, is a big threat these days. She gives these armoured elites big rerolls to hit and wound, and is just generally scary herself in melee as well, a big threat that the opponent can't really ignore pushing up the board there. The sisters do have some armoured support if they need it, the Castigator being a good example with its Holy Battle Cannon fire. There's also the missile launching Exorcist as well, which can fire out of line of sight. Can be useful to hit the things and damage enemy armour that multi-melters or melee might have trouble reaching. Finally, the sisters are supported by a bunch of ecclesiarchy units as well, the Arco-Flagellants being kind of fun. Limbs replaced with whip coils that can just absolutely decimate enemy infantry formations, and with extremist trigger words they can stack so many saves that even tough stuff really has to fear being dragged down by a weight of dice. Overall, between all this, sisters are doing really quite well in the competitive game right now. Around about 52% wins and certainly some top tournament performance too. They might be an army that tends to be a little bit stronger in competitive games as opposed to casual when you've got quite a lot of terrain on the board to hide their more fragile profiles. But overall the Emperor's Faithful might not be having the worst time of it at the moment. Next up we've got the Golden Guardians of Terror in the Adeptus Custodes. These chunky Auramite-clad elites tend to fight as a very dangerous shield wall sort of formation, each model incredibly valuable and few in number, and usually built around infantry units marching up the board to take the midfield objectives, daring the enemy to be able to take them off them. They've got strong melee with their Guardian Spears that can take down enemy elites and particularly Space Marines quite easily. They're not really that much range damage from their units comparatively, unless you go dipping into their Forge World options. Perhaps one of their standout things is just how tough the individual models are to take down. Even your most basic Custodian is 3 wounds with a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable and toughness 6, and that's very hard to kill for a lot of enemies out there, particularly en masse. It remains to be seen if Games Workshop is going to do anything to protect them against devastating wounds again, which the Codex seemingly removed. Otherwise though, their core faction rule is the Martial Qatar, doubling down on their melee with a choice of stance in the fight phase. You can either pick up sustained hits or lethal hits depending on what you're fighting. The Codex has redone the detachments in a big way. They're certainly a little bit less impactful than the Index version of Custodes was, with the absence of things like Fights First or Reviving Custodians. Probably the strongest looking detachments are perhaps the Talons of the Emperor, with some mortal wound protection next to Sisters of Silence and lots of good stratagems, or the Shield Host where you can opt for a big damage turn in melee for your Custodes, where they all get better AP and critical hits on a 5+. For a few key units, Custodian Guard are perhaps the standard troops of the army, 45 points per model and often fighting with Guardian Spear. These guys can really put the smack down in close combat, with 5 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, all hitting on 2s because they're hyper elite of course. The Alaris Terminators are quite a nice supporting option for them. They get a bit more ranged firepower that can actually help thin out hordes quite well, plus their melee helps with tanks and vehicles getting rerolls against them there. And they also have a once per game from Golden Light Shunt when they can jump across the board and hit the enemy from an unexpected angle. That's not the worst thing to have in the bag for a relatively slow moving army. Sisters of Silence are the other Talon of the Emperor. They're nowhere near as hard to kill but nowhere near as expensive. Can be handy to have some of them around in small units for cheap screening and scoring. There's some things that just don't really make sense to committing entire squads of Custodians to be doing. And for one example of an impactful leader, the Blade Champion is rather nice. He can have his unit advance and charge and re-roll charge rolls. That's a big threat range increase versus the squad just foot slogging normally. Theoretically, with a maximal roll, you could charge something anywhere up to 24 inches away, which is kind of intimidating. It's no slouch when he gets there either, with a strength 6 damage 3 profile with devastating wounds, better at taking out enemy Terminators and things than the squads that he leads. Prior to the Codex, the Adeptus Custodes have been doing incredibly well in game, really very strong with 56% wins overall and a massively tough faction for most armies to deal with. From initial impressions of the Codex though, that is looking like it's going to be dropping really quite a lot. Several important units and stratagems got nerfs, plus they're a lot more susceptible to things like devastating wounds and even mortal wounds again, neither of which will be good things for the army going forward. For the big stompy robots of Warhammer 40k, we've got the Imperial Knights. They play very differently to most other factions, being an entire army of vehicles and super heavy walkers. You basically get to play as a mini army of titans in 40k. As you'd expect, every single model being a dangerous vehicle with heavy firepower and good melee just gives you loads of raw power. They can maybe struggle with terrain and certain matchups though, not really liking things that can hide away from their might, and certainly disliking things that go really heavy into anti-tank firepower. They are kind of a skew list by nature, and playing with or against them is playing a very different sort of game of 40k. Their major army mechanic is the Code Chivalric. They get to choose either the vows of Lalo the Tyrant or Reclaim the Realm. Both of those give you a boost and also a deed to do, and if you complete that deed, then you get a whole bunch of command points and your army gets better in other ways as well. Generally I feel like these are kind of badly balanced though. Lalo the Tyrant is just vastly better than Reclaim the Realm. Getting easy access to rerolls on models with scary attacks is a bit of a no-brainer. Otherwise, for army mechanics, you get bondsman abilities. Plenty of the Questoris and the Cerastus Knights can directly oversee the armigers to give them all sorts of boosts themselves. You get a 6+ Feel No Pain from the detachment rule that can be boosted to a 5+ if you complete the objective, which is really big if you do manage to slay the Warlord. And for trying to shield you against some of the nastiest anti-tank damage, you get Ion Shields, invulnerable saves that work at range only, and for 1 command point you can rotate Ion Shields to give your knight a flare of protection, upping the invulnerable save to a 4+, or a knight that the opponent's trying to focus down. For a few unit examples, perhaps the closest things that the Imperial Knights have to troops are the Armigers. The Armiger Warglaves are the ones with melter weapons and a chain cleaver, pretty much the frontline troops of the army. It's hard to go too far wrong with these, big melter firepower at range and a fairly generalist close combat profile, plus a lot of objective control. Perhaps out of the bigger knights, one of the single scariest for the points is Canis Rex, a named character special knight that hits on 2+ and gets sustained hits very easily as well, and has just enormous melee damage with Freedom's Hand, plus an alright gun as well. Kind of fun that Sir Hector gets out when the knight dies, so you can have a knight pilot wandering around and being annoying on objectives and things in a last ditch of heroism. The Armiger Helverin is the more range support version of the Warglaive. Kind of nice to have a few of these hanging around in the backfield and can be a good choice to guard the home objective. They're quite relevant while Necrons are strong at the moment, having anti-fly firepower that's actually okay against things like Votann could help out a little bit in that matchup. Finally, for one example of a bigger knight, we've got the Knight Castellan. Enormous anti-armor firepower with a Volcano Lance and one of the biggest plasma guns you've ever seen. This guy's a bit more specced to dealing with enemy armor, can be quite good if you're facing enemy tanks or super heavies across the board. At the moment, the points changes and the rules boost that Knights got last time do seem to have helped out the faction quite a lot. They're kind of middling strength at the moment, a 49% win rate. Typically Knight armies will do a bit better in more casual games versus super competitive ones, particularly if you're playing without that much terrain on the board or against de-optimized armies that just might not have had as much anti-tank to deal with your skew list. Still though, nice to see them in a place where they're good but not overpowered, and a fair few of the big Knights are generally usable, more than you can say for Chaos. Finally, for the Imperium, before we get into other flavours of Space Marine, we have the Agents of the Imperium. These guys are characters and small units of other agents to help support other Imperial armies and generally provide interesting boosts, maybe some fun psyche abilities or grunts for objectives to the other Imperial armies, and a few of them are really quite interesting. The way they work is that you can take a certain amount of their units depending on army size, usually amounting to up to 1 character unit and 1 retinue unit per 1,000 points worth of game that you're playing. Within the Agents of the Imperium, there are the Assassins, specialised lone operatives dedicated to killing characters in their own unique way. The Calidus Assassin is perhaps one of the most interesting, using polymorphine to jump all over the board, potentially doing secondary objectives, ruining an enemy stratagem, and having a good chance to snipe an enemy character out of a unit if she should so choose. Really quite a nice support piece there. Otherwise, the fast-moving Eversaw Assassin can scout and blend infantry, just generally handy enough to have around, while the Vindicator could snipe foes from afar. They can be quite nice for Imperial armies that don't get access to good lone operatives. The Inquisitors are allowed to lead battle line units or henchmen. Comboing with random battle line units out of different factions can have some interesting combos. Maybe one interesting one is Kyria Draxus, whose rules allow her to hide a unit from shooting, plus has some fairly potent range firepower in herself. She's quite nice to combine with Custodian Guard, potentially getting double shooting and reroll wound rolls on a good day. The henchman retinues that they can bring alongside them can be handy as well. Cheap little 40-point units that can act as Imperial grunts for armies that don't get cheap units, such as Imperial Knights, can be handy enough to have around as nuisance units for screening or just standing on objectives. Plenty of the other Inquisitors might be kind of borderline useful, or just fun to have in an army for a more fluff and flavour sort of pick. There are quite a few more than that as well: rogue traders, navy breachers, or exaction squads. A few minor characters and retinue units that you can include, most of them not desperately strong, but kind of fun enough if you wanted to include them in a force for a bit of difference and flavour. Lastly, for the Imperium, let's talk through the ranks of Space Marines. First up, we'll start with the more Codex-themed chapters, and then talk through the more divergent ones with their own models and ranges. For the Codex chapters, they aren't necessarily locked to any one detachment, but each one of them does have a detachment that kind of fits them well for the lore. Plus they get some unique characters that only their chapter can choose. Starting with the Ultramarines, the Romanesque 40k poster boys often fight within their themed Gladius task force, tactically balanced with different combat doctrines, generally giving them different ways of dealing damage after advancing or falling back. This force can put a lot of firepower together with a fire discipline combo, giving a lethal hits unit the fire discipline enhancement, and then just absolutely demolishing one enemy unit with Oath of Moment plus a big unit of Aggressors or Hellblasters or something. The Ultramarines have got lots of cool characters. Marneus Calgar can give you advance and charge and farms command points. Uriel Ventress can be kind of fun in deep striking units that normally can't, such as maybe Centurions in Vanguard Task Force. Targerius is an okay generalist, and Rabute Gilliman the Primarch is an interesting centerpiece. There may be a touch on the overcosted side versus Calgar right now, I'd say. For the White Scars, we've got the fast-moving Mongolian biker marines from Chagoris. Their themed detachment is the Stormlance Task Force, fast melee with advance and charge army-wide, and loads of support for mounted units in stratagems and enhancements. Their main problem is that core Space Marines only really have the 2 mounted units in the Outriders and the Invader ATV. Neither of them are really unusable, but really struggle to carry the raw damage of the faction. It weirdly means that the detachment's far better for Space Wolves, loving it for their Thunderwolves. They just have the 1 character unit in Kosaro Khan. He could make 1 unit of Blade Guard or Assault Intercessors excessively fighting, a pretty scary combatant against enemy characters. The Iron Hands are the dour and calculating Space Marines from Medusa, loving their mechanized warfare and dreadnoughts and bionic enhancements. Their themed detachment is the Ironstorm Spearhead, getting flat more damage on every single unit than really good stratagem support for vehicles and dreadnoughts in particular. Options like Mercier's Weakness to just focus down 1 damaged enemy unit with extreme prejudice, and some really good enhancements focusing on their tech marines, giving vehicles the ability to basically cancel failed saves or get lethal hits in a big aura, which is kind of scary for any sort of big damage dealer. Ironfather Fyros is their unique character. He can repair 3 wounds to a vehicle per turn, has a little bit of range damage and some alright melee, and is quite nice in something like a squad of heavy intercessors for a 5+ feel no pain. Maybe the challenge being to make all of those fairly good rules work at the same time. For the Sneaky Sons of Korax, we have the Raven Guard. Their themed detachment is the Vanguard Spearhead. It makes them hard to hit and cover at long range, so it's going to punish enemy gun lines more so than melee armies, and then stratagems and enhancements for stealth and infiltration tricks, things like reactive moves to charging, infiltrating a scary unit up front that you wouldn't normally be able to, or taking units on and off the board, which can be really scary with firepower things, potentially returning to reserve, then appearing again, and with great line of sight on their targets. Weirdly enough, Ultramarines can really quite like this one, Calgar getting Infiltrate in combination with an Apothecary Biologist perhaps, and Centurions with Uriel Ventress warping round the board essentially, as they sneak around in a rather surprising way. The Raven Guard's unique unit is Kavan Shrike, who I do think is really quite interesting. He gives lone operative style shooting protection to a big unit of assault intercessors with jump packs or Vanguard veterans, meaning that you've got a fairly dangerous squad that can't be shot at long range, near enough guaranteed to get the first strike with their good movement. For the Salamanders, their themed detachment is the Firestorm Assault Force, kind of interestingly close range damage dealing plus transport tricks. All your ranged weapons gain assault, so you get to move forward extra fast with them, and you get +1 strength within 12 inches, rewarding things that want to get up close like flamers and melters, very Salamanders there. They also have some infantry damage combos, like some torrent devastating wounds, which is rather nice, or just a +1 to wound is very usable, plus things to allow units to jump out of transports and shoot you. There's a lot of raw might to be had here. Both of their unique characters are quite good, I'd say. Vulcan Hestan can mark 1 target for full wound rerolls with Torrent and Melter weapons, exactly what things like Infernus Marines or a Land Raider Redeemer want to see on the board. And Adrax Agatone is just a bit of a melee powerhouse. He really likes running with Blade Guard, maybe charging out of a Land Raider, and hitting the enemy hard with a big damage 3 hammer and rerolling wound rolls. Finally, for the more notable core Codex Space Marines, we've got the Imperial Fists. Their themed detachment is the Anvil Siege Force, heavy weapons for everything, so +1 to hit if you're stationary, +1 to wound for anything that was heavy already. It basically incentivizes you to build around a fairly static Space Marine firebase that only redeploys when it absolutely needs to. Beyond that, they do have some stratagems to boost firepower and gunline marines in other ways, such as being able to step back from combat and calmly shoot the foe in the face. Unfortunately, this isn't really considered to be one of the stronger ones, unlike most of the rest. Unless you're playing on a table that's really quite low in terrain, then movement is a bit of a necessity. And again, it means that this one tends to do a bit better in casual games versus hyper-competitive ones. Otherwise, the Fists have 3 characters, including Pedro Cantor of the Crimson Fists. Tor Garadon's kind of good against vehicles, but less so against other things. Lysander just hits really hard with his damage 3 and gets -1 to wound for Terminators, though it's kind of dependent on them getting good. And Pedro Cantor's quite a nice all-round generalist, His +1 attack once per game is really quite a big boost for his unit, and could make you some fairly impressively shooty stern guard if you wanted. After the various Codex chapters, I'd probably rate the Ultramarines, Salamanders, and Kayvan Shrike of some of the strongest characters on offer though. Moving on past the core Codex though, we've got the Divergent chapters. Starting out, we've got the Crusading Marines of the Black Templars. Classically, they often tend to play as a sort of close range on foot army, marching up the board either in vast Crusader squads as a sort of Horde Marine sort of option. You can put a lot of bodies on the board if you want to, maybe having some Sword Brethren or something deploy out of a Land Raider, another unit that they're well known for. Black Templars can definitely do well with a whole bunch of the different Space Marine detachments. Their own unique one is really quite good in the Righteous Crusaders. It makes the Marines extra durable with a 6+ Feel No Pain save that can be swapped out for other vows, plus some really nice melee damaging options, including changing out the vows on scary units like Sword Brethren. The 10 Houses Bones is a rather nice enhancement as well for the 5+ Feel No Pain on one unit, and Black Templars also get some curiously cheap multi-melters on plenty of vehicles due to their upgrade sprue, making them very good in Ironstorm Spearhead, and certain units like Impulsors and Gladiators far more interesting and threatening for them. For a couple of key units, High Marshal Helbrecht and the Sword Brethren stand out as a unit that can just go through virtually any unit in the game when they're on a maxed out combo. If you do go whole hog and include a Castellan in the units, they can potentially one-round entire Titans in a turn on average dice, which is sort of mind-boggling. Otherwise, I think the standard Primaris Crusader squad is quite nice. Marines on Horde mode with a lot of wounds and objective control on the table for the points cost. Currently, Black Templars seem to be the most competitive out of the Space Marine chapters, winning around about 52% of tournament games. They do have a lot of very strong options in addition to the core stuff. For the Blood Angels, it's all about the ferocious melee assault. Their classic playstyle tends to be all about fast jump pack units soaring through the air on wings of fire, delivering death to the enemy in glorious melee. Their Sons of Sanguinius detachment really exemplifies this. Getting +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge makes marine melee units go from kind of okay to really quite threatening on the charge, particularly for things like jump intercessors and assault intercessors. The Death Company units are characterised by their black rage, a 6+ Feel No Pain, re-rolling hit rolls, and the inability to think about objectives and things unless they have chaplains watching over them. The black-clad warriors that have fallen to the visions of their dying Primarch are perhaps one of the strongest melee threats that the Blood Angels can bring to bear, particularly a jump pack unit alongside Chaplain Lamartes is just all around mighty, massive damage with Power Fists and Inferno pistols, and Lamartes makes them both more dangerous and also -1 damage in return, so far harder to kill. Another strong unit is the Sanguinor. The mysterious angelic saviour of the chapter can threaten to heroic intervene into close combat even when he's off the board, and then fights first to tip the balance in a key combat, potentially deleting an enemy unit that was just about to kill one of yours. Overall, it does seem like the fortunes of the Blood Angels have turned around a little bit, with the Sons of Sanguinius getting that extra strength buff that they got in the last balanced data slate. They're sort of lower mid for Warhammer 40k at the moment, around about 47% tournament wins, in a better space than they've been for the most of 10th edition. The Nordic Fury of the Space Wolves is next, a ferocious and mighty chapter that's all about the massive melee damage, being able to give and take blows in sheer might. They've got lots of close combat units in their roster, and their unique detachment is Champions of Rust that allows you to gain saga boosts if you manage to do certain mighty actions in the army with your character units, though unfortunately it's a little bit unreliable to actually trigger these buffs against any given opponent. You might have real difficulty against some. As a result, quite a lot of Space Wolf players tend to be using the Stormlance Task Force, the sort of White Scars themed one for advance and charge, and that's really great with Thunderwolves. Lots of stuff that helps out mounted units there, including extreme speed, hard-hitting melee, and powerful defensive stratagems. The Thunderwolf Cavalry are thus a rather strong unit for the chapter at the moment, just 30 points each for big tough stat lines with a 4+ invulnerable save, and a whole flurry of attacks with +1 damage on the charge, and some very nice character options to lead them that also get that bonus. For other interesting units in the chapter, Bjorn the Fell-Handed is a fairly fearsome dreadnought as they go, hard to take down with a high save and some solid defensive rules, plus some mighty melee. Otherwise, the Savage Devolved Wolfen are a bit of a threat on the battlefield as well. Their weakness is they can't help out with objectives, but given that they have some absolutely brutal melee stat lines for their cheap 80 points per 5 of them. Okay speed, getting invulnerable saves, and a whole load of damage to attacks with those hammers. Overall, Space Wolves are doing okay right now, fairly strong in game at like 49% wins, a lot of that carried by their Stormlance task force. For their bitter rivals, we have the Dark Angels. They're a chapter kind of split into 3 parts. The tanky Terminators and other veterans of the Deathwing, the arrow swift and stealthy bikers of the Raven Wing. They bring massive speed and alpha strikes with their detachment, and then have plenty of core Codex Space Marine options, which they often tend to fall back on things like plasma fire and range damage, perhaps a little bit more so than melee for some of them. Some units get to be accompanied by their shadowy little horrors in the Watchers of the Dark to protect against things like mortal wounds, and otherwise besides their detachments that support Deathwing and Ravenwing quite well, we've got the Unforgiven Task Force, a detachment with a bit of an underwhelming special rule with Grim Resolve giving you better objective control and guards you against losing it to Battle Shock, and besides that they get a fair few shooting boosts. They can do Ironstorm Spearhead rather well, weirdly enough. Azrael plus a Dark Shroud can really make a more armoured list work. Extra command points for those stratagems plus extra cover and stealth really helps out the vehicles survive. For some interesting or standout units, we've got Grandmaster Azrael. He's arguably the single strongest datasheet in the detachment right now, rustling up command points and giving good damage and defensive boosts to his squad. For his current 105 points, he's pretty much auto-include and in every single competitive army list. For one example of the Deathwing Terminators, we've got the Deathwing Knights. They don't have quite as much damage as certain Terminator units, but are just massively tanky, 4 wounds each and a -1 damage, and defense against mortal wounds with that Watcher. Maybe a little bit overcosted in points right now, but certainly an interesting Terminator squad if they ever do go down a bit. For the Ravenwing, perhaps one unit that isn't too hard to use at the moment is the Ravenwing Dark Shroud. You are paying a bit of a tax for an aura of -1 to hit and cover, though that can be pretty meaningful against quite a lot of units out there. Particularly on more tanky units with higher saves, armoured units get on particularly well with that, and it can be seen in tournament lists alongside things like Storm Ravens or Dreadnoughts. Overall, Dark Angels are sort of lower mid overall, around about 46% wins when taken as a whole, though it does seem that they do significantly better with Ironstorm Spearhead, and more core Space Marine detachments, they admittedly haven't been having so much success with their unique ones. Finally, for our many flavours of Space Marine, we have the Deathwatch, the Xenos hunting arm of the Inquisition. These guys iconically play as mixed unit kill teams, comprised of many different veterans working together as one, often including interesting things like bike units, jump packs, and Terminators within a 10-man squad. For their core detachments, they get mission tactics, 3 different turns of fairly meaningful damage boosts, either lethal hits, sustained hits, or better against characters, and they back that up with a few interesting teleport tricks, anti-Xenos options, and various types of stratagems that can make bolter fire extra dangerous. One of their biggest and most threatening units is the Proteus kill team. They're the ones that are based on the more firstborn sort of Space Marine veteran profile. They can have really quite savage shooting at close range with a bunch of frag cannons, and maybe take things like heavy thunderhammers, or multiple Terminators with cyclone missile launchers to add to the firepower. Really quite a big dangerous unit for putting any sort of firepower synergy on. I have seen them used in Gladius Task Force with Fire Discipline before. Otherwise, for HQ units, the Watchmaster isn't awful. He's got one of those rules to ruin enemy stratagems, a not too bad sort of Captain Melee kind of profile. And he's one of the models that can bear the Tome of Exoclades, giving the Deathwatch a fairly fantastically boosted Oath of Moment with massive rerolls against 2 different units on one turn. Despite having a few interesting options though, it doesn't seem to be coming together for the Deathwatch at the moment. I feel like their detachment is interesting enough, that the 3 favours of Bolter Stratagem do hog a fair bit of the rule space. Perhaps their biggest issue is that all their kill teams just feel a little bit overcosted in points for what they do right now, even if you can make some interesting units that can do some big combo things. Next up, let's get on to the Forces of Chaos, and first up we have Death Guard, an army that classically plays slow and durable, lots of units not having all that much movement, but generally trying to grind down the foe with attrition warfare, things wounding the enemy a bit easily, but maybe not doing as much damage when they hit, and overall at the moment tending to do more damage at close range with shooting and assault, as opposed to long range fire. Their core rule is Nurgle's Gift, the contagions of Nurgle spreading out further and further from their models as the battle goes on. If you're within this aura range, then you get your toughness reduced by 1, and also an extra pre-game determined buff, maybe -1 to hit, or extra AP against your units. The Death Guard also get an extra point of toughness on most of their units compared with much of 40k, harder to bring down with small arms, and a whole ton of their weapons are plague weapons, that being represented by lethal hits in 10th edition, so a lot of things that auto wound the enemy very easily. Looking at a few key units for the faction, the Plague Marines are the Blighted Battle line, 90 points per 5 and packing an awful lot of special weapons. They're quite nice to fight for the midfield with, jumping out of rhinos most of the time. The Plague Burst Crawler is the Death Guard artillery piece, a big splash of a Plague Burst mortar to take down enemies out of line of sight. It can coordinate with things like the Lord of Virulence, plus some entropy cannons for shredding enemy armor and elites. As it goes, it's fairly tanky, good toughness and wounds, and a 2+ save. Deathshroud Terminators are some of the shock elite of the army. A really nice combination of very tough, very dangerous in combat, and can teleport into battle, though their biggest weakness is they're really quite slow when they are on the board. They might struggle to catch the foe. Finally, for one pestilent support character, we've got the Biologist Putrefier. They're quite commonly seen with the Plague Marines in the Rhinos, throwing grenades around at close range and dousing the enemy in mortal wounds, which can be a really big damage punch in the midfield. Currently, Death Guard don't seem to be doing too badly in tournaments right now. A win rate of a nice 7 of 7s with 49%, certainly a lot better than their situation was towards the start of 10th edition. Next up, we've got their Tzeentchian brothers in the Thousand Sons, generally playing as a clanking rubric automata battle line backed up by powerful sorcerers. Generally, Thousand Sons tend to play a bit more range versus melee, usually their units having kind of alright profiles just in their own right, and needing to use all their sorcerers' tricks from psycho buffs and their Kabbalistic rituals to be able to gain the edge over the enemy, and make sure they get the advantages in the confrontations with those. The Kabbalistic rituals are the army's core mechanic, sort of like an old school psychic phase pretty much. The more sorcerers that you have on the board, the more ritual points you have to spend, and these can give you some seriously big options, things like stripping the saves from an enemy unit to put it down really easily, doing bolt for some mortal wounds, or other things like double movement and cancelling saves. Literally all of these are powerful and can be the right choice. I feel like they do have to play a bit true to their nature though, as you have to make some very big decisions as to whether or not you get one powerful ability or pass up another, and it could send the battle down some very different directions depending on what you go for. Otherwise, beyond that, their Cult of Magic detachment boosts their psychic damage, nice for any of the sorcerers and particularly for Magnus himself. Their Rubric Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators boast some toughness with some good invulnerable saves, and Inferno weapons for extra AP on anything that's a bolt weapon or flamer. And for one of their particularly impactful enhancements, the Umbralific Crystal could potentially have a sorcerer and a squad of rubrics teleporting across the board to put the hurt on enemy chaff at close range. Units-wise, the Rubric Marines are pretty much the backbone of the army, generally tended to be fielded in big numbers in most competitive lists. They make good retinues for the big cast of sorcerers that Thousand Sons have access to, and generally their Warp Flamers and Soul Reaper cannons can be pretty threatening to enemy infantry. They also help a little bit with Cabal points. Sorcerers of various stripes will typically be leading the rubrics. There are a fair few to choose from between the Standard 1, Exalted 1, on and off disc, plus the Infernal Master. And Ahriman himself can be pretty brutal for a free Kabbalistic ritual and a +1 to wound on the Rubric Marines. They are a pretty interesting army where it often feels like you're more taking the squad to support the sorcerer compared with the other way around, maybe as it should be. Magnus the Red is pretty much a pivotal unit for the Thousand Sons right now. He's pretty expensive in points, but he is a psychic linchpin, massive damage with his psychic shooting attacks, and he backs that up with melee, very fast and helps out your nearby units. He's also probably the best target for the vast majority of stratagems and Kabbalistic rituals to help out. He generally gets included in most competitive lists. Finally, for a bit of mutant support, the Thousand Sons get a fair few chaff units, but they also have the Mutalith Vortex Beast, a somewhat tanky monster with the option of several different shooting attacks, including a terrifying d6+6 damage Warp Lance. If one of those connects, then it can be curtains for an enemy tank. It can also boost the range of Kabbalistic rituals as well for long-range doom bolts and things. Overall, between all that, the Thousand Sons are a pretty powerful army when mastered. They're currently winning quite a lot of tournaments, around about 52% win rates. Certainly an army with some absolutely devastating options against the right foes. Moving on to the Chaos Space Marines who prefer the violence of Khorne, we have the World Eaters. These Berserk Maniacs are pretty simple in terms of their army playstyle. It's all about raw melee damage, nice and simple. They might not have excessive speed, but they can rush up the board with scout moves and things, and the whole game plan is to smash the enemy army asunder with heavy blows of various chain axes. Their core army rule is the Blessings of Khorne. You roll your 8d6 to the Blood God and then get to choose up to 2 powers out of a table. Lots of options can be useful in the right situation. In particular, the +2 to movement and then the advance and charge can be really big, can potentially have you rocketing across the table and get into combat super early. If the charge is going to be a bit more reliable though, you might just want better raw melee damage, or even trading things out for feel no pain. Otherwise, for their detachment rule, they get +1 strength and +1 attack on the charge, and some fairly dangerous stratagems for a bit of extra damage, defense, or speed as needed. For some key units, we've got the 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound. These guys are the elites of the army, hulking mutated space marines with demons inside them. They can go scouting up the board really quite quickly, and in particular the Exalted 8-bound are good at breaking virtually anything that they touch with their massive chain fist damage. Lord Invocatus on his fiery steed, often seen running alongside the Exalted 8-bound in particular. He can make them scout moves, so get them up the board to threaten those early charges, particularly with the Blessings of Khorne. He's no slouch in combat himself with his axe Coward's Bane. Khorne Berserkers are the foot troops of the army, maybe a bit better at dealing with enemy lighter infantry and chaff compared with heavy things, though they can certainly have their role, often seen piling out of rhinos to take the midfield objectives, where they can be kind of problematic to deal with due to their blood surge. If you shoot one of them dead, they might be able just to walk into combat with you, something that might give the enemy target priority issues. Finally, we have the man himself. Angron, Demon Primarch of Khorne, is utterly terrifying. He moves really fast, breaks virtually anything he touches with enormous melee stats, and even if you do manage to take him out, then he's got a chance to revive on death if Khorne graces you with a 666 on the Blessings dice. Having Angron just return to the battle or health restored is a ridiculous swing of points, but can be a bit random, sometimes could literally be the difference between winning and losing if he resurrects early. Overall, following some points nerfs, unfortunately the World Eaters are a little bit lower in the rankings, around about 46% wins or so. They did take some big nerfs both to points and to some of their detachment rules. Still a pretty terrifying army to be getting up in your face quite so early in the game though, can definitely cause some problems for enemies that aren't prepared to receive such a massive rush. Next up we have the Servants of the Deities themselves, the Chaos Demons issuing from the Warp, a bit of an unusual army in Warhammer 40K. Their faction's very melee focused, pretty much a fantasy army but in space, typically tending to bobble out of the warp in various different ways, so their whole army gets deep strike and can attack the foe from unexpected angles. To some extent they're basically 4 armies in one, demons in service of each deity, and kind of limited support between the demonic units if they don't have the same deity keywords. For their core mechanic, as mentioned, basically everything gets deep strike, and you can potentially get some very close range charges with the Shadow of Chaos. The idea is that you extend ball control over as much of the board as possible, and if you can remain in charge of the midfield objectives, the opponent's going to take easier battle shock tests, and your demons can charge out of the warp at very close range. Your units getting the chance to regrow some lost wounds when they're badly damaged with battle shock as well is kind of fun. Otherwise, they're an army that goes heavy on the invulnerable saves, most things relying on them as opposed to armor saves. It means the enemy AP is kind of bad against them, but volume fire are a bit more effective and they don't have quite as much use for cover. They've got some powerful movement stratagems to warp them on and off the table, such as stratagems for close range deep strike and return to reserve, and they can be allies to other chaos armies as summoned demons. For a few scary units within their lineup, the Flamers of Tzeentch can torch infantry and have really quite good overwatch. They're one of the few good shooting units that demons have and can be pretty interesting deep striking because of that. Pretty reliable to get their damage output off, and overwatch can cause problems even after they're on the board. Blood Crushers are pretty mighty cavalry of Khorne. They get mortal wounds on the charge that can account for a lot of damage, plus can get some layered buffs between characters and maybe a nearby Blood Throne, one of the stronger units to deal melee damage on the charge here. The Great Unclean One, with its sheer bulk and durability, is one of the better greater demons right now. Damage output isn't exactly stellar, but for 230 points plus the enhancement cost, it can be just massively tanky, a threat that the opponent isn't going to end very easily unless they're focusing half an army against it, and having one of these guys just waddling up the board towards one of the midfield objectives could be extremely annoying. Finally, for the power of Chaos Undivided, we've got Be'lakor. The Dark Master can be a real spoiler unit in the midst of an army, stopping enemy gun lines from shooting the demons that are nearby him from too far away, and guaranteeing that he can get close before you get to damage them. He also gets his own personal bubble of Shadow of Chaos to allow the good stuff that brings in a reliable area. Overall, following big points changes, the Chaos Demons are now genuinely quite strong, around about 51% wins at tournaments. Nice to see them capable of challenging the enemy good stuff again now. Can be a really spooky army to fight with the very different way that they play. Next up for Scions of the Dark Gods, we have the Chaos Knights, the treacherous fallen nobles, and destructive renegades. Again, like the Imperial Knights, they play very differently to the rest of Warhammer 40k armies, an entire faction full of vehicles, some of them super heavies. As with their Imperial counterparts, they bring lots of raw power to the table, big datasheets with chunky stat lines, and massive guns and big melee. They dislike terrain and anti-tank in a similar sort of way to the Imperial Knights, but maybe a little bit less for the terrain given that they do have the option to ghost through walls with a stratagem. Rather than a detachment rule that adds to raw strength, the Chaos Knights are perhaps the biggest battle shock army out there. Harbingers of Dread gives them an aura of -1 to leadership tests, and that combines with the detachment rule for making enemies test if they've taken any meaningful damage within 12 inches as well. So it basically means that you are going to be handing out far more tests if you're fighting for the midfield objectives, and there's a good chance that enemies that thought they should have been able to take a point just won't be able to. That doubles down going into better damage and defense from round 3 onwards, where if you can make things battle shocks, you'll be able to wound those enemy units a lot more easily, and they'll also struggle to hit you. Otherwise, like the Imperials, they get their Iron Shields and Diabolic Bulwark, the invulnerable saves against range and the ability to increase it for 1 unit for 1 command point. They can be fielded as Dreadblade allies to the other factions, maybe adding in some Wardog Brigands for some fire support or similar. And for other detachment things, they've got Knights of Shades to walk through walls and defeat that terrain and make some unexpected charges perhaps, and the Panoply of Cursed Knights to make one of your big knights extra tanky, ignoring a little bit of AP. For some of the stronger Chaos Knights out there, the Wardog Carnivore is just an absolute brutal little murder machine. It moves really fast, hits on a 2+ in melee with a lot of attacks with some great damage profiles, has good objective control, and even a little bit of ignores line of sight firepower with that Havoc launcher if it wants. Overall, there's not a lot not to like. For their Imperial Armor Index, the Chaos Knight Lancer seems to be doing quite well for them these days. Another dedicated melee specialist, this one, that can rush up the board extra fast. This one is a little bit more reliably staying alive than other big knights, given that it gets a 4+ invulnerable save, range and melee with that enormous shield that it has. It's got a stat line that's going to really punish most enemy hard targets, taking out huge chunks of them in one go, plus free tank shock for a bucket load of mortal wounds on the charge. For some firepower vassals, the Wardog Brigands are just very sturdy and very dangerous little gun turrets. Again, they hit on a 2+ with a big anti-tank gun and a big anti-infantry gun. Really quite nicely balanced, and you can take quite a lot of them in one army list and it not be a bad idea. And otherwise, for the other big Titanic Knights, people do like to run their Wardogs a bit more so than them right now, unfortunately. But certainly in more casual games, the Titanic Knights are very usable, I think. Maybe one good example being the Knight Desecrator, a massive anti-tank weapon plus some sturdy melee, and gives rerolls to Wardogs, which can be handy enough for Wardog Brigands. Currently, the Chaos Knights are kind of similar to the Imperial Knights, fairly well balanced versus the rest of Warhammer 40k. They've got around about a win percentage of 49 overall, generally having a good time of it in games between some scary Wardogs and some big battle shock debuffs. Might be a bit nicer if they had a better balance between Wardogs versus big knights though, as a lot of the top lists do tend to be Wardog spam. Finally, for the Forces of Chaos, we have the Chaos Space Marines, an army that might well be sure to be in flux at time of recording, given that they should be the next codex out. Currently though, I feel like they do have really quite cool faction rules, all the hallmarks of a Space Marine army with fairly elite infantry, but generally tending to be a bit more melee focused than their loyalist counterparts for the most part, and really being quite big into big combos and damage output with their dark packs that they can access. Their core rule are the dark packs, where you take a leadership test and have the chance of taking a little bit of mortal wounds if you fail, but whether you do pass or fail, the gods grate you with lethal hits and sustained hits to your damage, which is really quite a big boost to get pretty much permanently across your army, and most serious damage dealers will find that a very good trade-off. Furthermore, it gets far better with the Chaos Marks that you can select. Each one gives you critical hits on a 5+ for one certain type of chosen Dark Pact, either at range or melee, and this really takes it to the next level. They back that all up with some seriously powerful stratagems, a Nurgle hide from shooting option at longer range, or undivided full wound rerolls. Very spooky to be able to turn on that amount of extra damage, or just hide from shooting full stop. And I've got quite a good enhancement to keep them coming in the Eye of Tzeentch to rustle up a few more command points for Apex doing units. For a few key units, we've got the Chaos Chosen, a rather terrifying squad of elites with a Chaos Lord, hitting out with a bunch of accursed weapon attacks. They can advance and charge, so they have a longer threat range than most infantry, and will often enjoy jumping out of a Rhino to put the smack down against the enemy's elites. The Forge Fiend is a fairly general purpose gun turret firepower unit, a whole bucket load of blasts with damage 3 and good AP. The Ectoplasma is very general purpose, extra attacks against hordes, and enough strength and devastating wounds if it wants to affect heavies. The Chaos Legionaries are the battle line of Chaos, fairly cheap power armoured units that have a fair amount of threat against enemies on objectives. Being cheap and having a good amount of objective control can just be handy to follow up the mainline damage dealer units. And for another example of some scary melee, the Warp Talons jumping out of the sky on jump packs and slicing the enemy up with their lightning claws are all very powerful. They particularly get on well with the Mark of Slaanesh, being able to advance and charge with one of the stratagems, and sustained hits on a 5+ is not a bad thing either. They'll absolutely blend anything Space Marine or lighter. Chaos Space Marines were very powerful earlier in the edition, though Games Workshop does seem to have brought them back into line with some points increases. Units are often paying a hefty tax now for the sheer amount of damage that they can dish out, and it's led them to be one of the weaker factions in 40k right now, around about 44% wins. Hopefully with a new codex on the way though, that should change around a bit, and they'll have really quite a lot of other ways to play with their different detachments. Finally for Chaos, and while we're on the subject of core Chaos Space Marines, I thought I'd just mention each of the legions, seeing as it will be asked for. At time of recording they don't really have any themed detachments or anything like that, that'll come with the codex for the most part, but still perhaps have their archetypical ways to play. The Black Legion are generally balanced and mighty, often having Terminators and Legionaries in their ranks. They have Abaddon the Despoiler himself as well, a bit of a Chaos linchpin that can just be an enormous threat in a very expensive Terminator unit, and also help out any Chaos nearby with big boost to their damage and rerolls. The Word Bearers are the profane zealots of the Dark Gods. They enjoy their demon packs and will get on well with Possessed and Demonkin. I feel like the Dark Packs detachment does represent them really quite well at the moment. The Emperor's Children are the Slaaneshi Legion. They get access to the Noise Marine and Lucius the Eternal datasheet. Noise Marines are okay, I guess. They're quite likely to get a codex sometime later in 10th edition, given that it's been announced that they're not having their core units reprinted in the Chaos Space Marine army, and will be served by a digital index until then, so watch this space for Fulgrim returning alongside some twisted Slaaneshi worshippers. The Bitter Iron Warriors are one of the more range-focused legions, efficiently deploying heavy firepower to wipe out their foes. They quite enjoy obliterators and demon engines, and Chaos Space Marine shooting can certainly be pretty savage in 10th edition with those dark packs going on. The Alpha Legion enjoy their infiltration and subterfuge type tricks, might enjoy stratagems like that Nurgle-esque one to hide things from view, and they're often known to employ a good amount of human cultists to do their bidding. Maybe a small cohort of Space Marines commanding a cultist horde to sweep across the objectives. You could maybe use some accursed cultists with dark communes for that, I guess. The Night Lords enjoy their terror tactics, classically striking with jump packs with units like Raptors and Warp Talons, striking from the shadows to spread terror and discord amongst the enemy's ranks. And of course there's plenty of other Chaos Forces, organisations and warbands out there, the creations of Bile like the Halted Mutated Combat Power, and have Bile's datasheet themselves. The Red Corsairs are piratical raiding forces led by Huron Blackhearts, and there's the followers of Vashtor out and about there as well, apparently going to be getting their new detachment and way to play in the Codex. I feel like a fair few of these really are waiting for the Codex to get their preferred way to play out there. Though I'll absolutely review that on the channel when we get it. Should be interesting to read through the rules and review them there. Finally, and moving on to the world of Xenos, we'll start out with the Eldar. The core Aeldari of the craft worlds often like to make war with speed and trickery, being very fast and very deadly, and a psychic heavy army with some powerful boosts from nearby Farseers. Typically these space elves are kind of low durability, but have lots of movement tricks and interesting stratagems and abilities to avoid being killed in return. The Aeldari perhaps tend to be a little bit more ranged firepower compared with melee, at least versus their cousins in the Drukhari. Their core mechanic is the Strands of Fate, a mechanic that's maybe not so very dissimilar to Sister's Miracle Dice. You roll 6d6 before the game begins, and then those dice can be substituted into all manner of prescribed rolls here, potentially generating you things like automatic saving throws or automatic devastating wounds and things, suddenly helped out by a Farseer that can flip those Strands of Fate to a 6. In combination with that, their Battle Host attachment just gives them some flat extra damage. A single reroll to hit and wound per time that a unit attacks is really powerful, and particularly so on hard-hitting anti-tank weapons, making things like their Bright Lances extra savage. Much of the rest of the detachment is given over to movement tricks, things like Phantasm or Fire and Fade that can be options for being out in the enemy's view, dealing damage to them, and then hiding away before they get to strike back at you effectively. For a few examples of strong Aeldari units, the Warp Spiders are one of their good fast movers. They can flick a jump for a big 24-inch move and then shred some enemy infantry with their devastating wound torrent weapons. The Autarch Wayleaper is a common include in competitive lists. An Autarch that generates you command points while also doing annoying lone operative things can just be good as a disruptive threat, and is often seen running around the board with a Phoenix gem just in case the foe should catch him up and destroy him. Warwalkers are one of the more efficient anti-tank platforms the Aeldari have. 2 Bright Lances are the most common loadout for some focused firepower that does great with the battle host rerolls, and invulnerable save and -1 to wound means that they're at least not too fragile on the return. The Aeldari deity incarnate is the Avatar of Cain, one mighty champion sacrificed to awaken the wrath of the bloody-handed god. The Avatar is a bit of a counterpoint to quite a lot of Aeldari units, big, tough and hard to take down, and is an enormous threat if it can make close combat. Finally, I think it's important to mention the Farseers. They can take the Fate Dice mechanic from good to great, meaning that you get more of those all-important 6s, which should have vastly more value than plenty of the other rolls. They can be used for extra long charges or devastating wounds, or other interesting things like automatic 6s on Overwatch for units like Fugan or the Avatar. Overall, still seems that Aeldari are in a fairly good place as 10th edition goes. They're certainly a long way from their absolute overpowered stuff that they had at the start of the edition. They still remain very good and get things done at tournaments. Currently they've got a 51% win rate, often people going heavy on their fast movers and nuisance units like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders and the Forge World Shadow Spectres. From the Craft Worlders to the Dark Eldar, next up we have the Drukhari. As with their slightly less murderous brothers, the Drukhari are very fast moving, often fighting from deadly skimmer transports, and their units generally tend to be fairly fragile, but will often get the first strike and hit very hard when they do so. They kind of operate as 3 sub-armies within the same codex, the Cabals, Witch Cults, and the Homunculus Covens, which can work in concert, or you can go heavy on one element of them as it makes sense. Their core rule is all very true for their nature. They enjoy the suffering of others and convert it into yet more suffering. You generate pain tokens when you destroy units or they fail battle shock, and then you can plug them into extra damage, getting big rerolls to hit either in range or in melee, and if it's in melee then you get extra AP as well, which I think was a good job to try and balance out the two sides of it. Fairly brutal, and is usually going to be best on your biggest and scariest units, though maybe can be a little bit snowbally, and there might be a few more pain tokens to go around against armies that have got lots of small units versus a few big ones. Otherwise, beyond that, their supporting rules are the Sky Splinter or the Real Space Raid, the Sky Splinter detachment being by far the better one, getting you things like Lance when you charge out of a transport in the same turn, plus some really big options like the Assault Ramp sort of stratagem for Incubi, allowing them to move a transport, jump out the front, and then charge something, potentially deny Overwatch as well if you want to with an enhancement. Real Space Raid is maybe a bit more general purpose and not just good for things in transports, though to be fair, things in transports is a pretty hefty part of the Drukhari army. Otherwise, for their army they get some poison weapons for some anti-infantry attacks, plus Dark Lancers for some particularly savage anti-vehicle. No matter the opponent, they will have some tools for the job. For key units, it probably makes sense to start out with their Raiders. These are the bigger of their 2 transport options that are both very usable, coming with a Dark Lance on top, and you can use them for ranged units or melee units, protecting them as they move up the board, potentially shooting from within if it makes sense, and quite a nice unit for carting the Cabalite warriors around to divulge a whole load of splinter fire. The elite guard of the Archon are the Incubi, fighting with their Claves and Demiclaves. The Sky Splinter detachment seems to have done enough to make them from being a kind of tame threat to a truly dangerous one, extra AP on hand from Power from Pain, and Lance on the melee. Potentially with an Archon in tow, they can absolutely blend the vast majority of normal sized units in the game in a single round of combat from a big charge out of transports. Commonly seen as some anti-tank in Drukhari lists are the Scourges. They get Dark Lances for big hitting anti-tank and can jump shoot jump. Very frustrating if you're getting shot but can't be shot and you don't have any indirect fire to take them down. Finally, the Shadowy Mandrakes with their fun new models they got from the Kill Team set. These are nice to have in the front ranks and infiltrating a unit that can screen out your army and have some presence on the midboard. then potentially warping around the board to do secondary objectives and things in the later game. Drukhari went from being really quite a weak army in Warhammer 40k to generally being in a good place. The detachment really added a lot of interest, and now as an army they're fairly strong with around about a 50% win rate, really quite balanced but threatening enough to punch up at big events. While we're on the Aeldari, I thought I'd touch on the Harlequins and the Ynnari, both as fairly major sections of the Aeldari army. Harlequins are the enigmatic mass performers in the checked holofield clothing, a sub-army within the Aeldari index, and kind of similarly fast-moving and hard-hitting, a bit of a focus on close-range attacks with fusion pistols and melee, though they do have a few longer-ranged units. The majority of their mechanics will be fairly similar to the Aeldari, fast-moving and fragile. They get the Battle Host and the Strands of Fate bonus, plus Battle Host movement shenanigans, and they can use the Travelling Players option to allow them to fight alongside Drukhari if you want to, though in general they perhaps tend to be a little bit weaker there. Not getting the built-in Battle Host rerolls that they're costed for is a bit of a downside if you use them as allies in that direction. Perhaps one of their most interesting units is the Harlequin troop. Can be an interesting one to field alongside Ivrain potentially as a fairly nasty melee threat. They can strike fairly hard up close with their special weapons and fusion pistols. And otherwise they do have some other good units. Their Skyweaver jet bikes are pretty nice, but they do have some pretty fun lone operatives as well. The Solitaire can blitz forward with some spectacular movements and put paid to entire squads of elite infantry, and the Death Jester is a lone operative that can shoot at range. The Shrieker Cannon picking up interesting special rules depending on the target that you want, and it's one of the best places to use that Fate's Messenger enhancement for the Aeldari. Overall, they don't quite as often tend to get focused on as an actual standalone faction these days, and realistically they are going to be a good amount weaker than Aeldari, given that their units just don't have quite as much scope. Might be one to watch when Aeldari do get their codex. I'd guess at the very least there'll be a Harlequin-centered detachment. Otherwise, for the Death Cult Aeldari of the Ynnari, they're an interesting and maybe slightly melee-focused hybrid Eldar army with the Craft Worlds and Drukhari, being able to draw quite a lot from their unit pools, just not getting access to a few certain things like the Avatar of Cain, Phoenix Lords and Coven's units. The main way that they work is that you have to take Ivrain as the Warlord to unlock them. As mentioned, she can be fairly scary with a whole bunch of mortal wounds against infantry, and then maybe backed up by a Harlequin troop for resurrecting them from death as a somewhat tanky Aeldari unit, strangely. But she basically allows you to take half your army as Drukhari bar a few datasheets, gaining access to the Battle Host rerolls and the Strands of Fate, and the Battle Host rerolls can apply to the Drukhari units, as can the stratagems, as they do have the Aeldari keyword as well. As well as Ivrain herself, the Incarn is at least fairly threatening. The option to jump around the board when units die, though admittedly far toned down from where they were earlier in the edition. The Aeldari Avatar of Death is still a force to be reckoned with though. Perhaps more notably at the forefront of Ynnari armies is the option to get some really interesting things from the Drukhari army. Mandrakes are quite nice as cheap objective doers that can bounce around the board. Scourges will absolutely love their jump shoot jump plus battle host rerolls, basically the same units but more dangerous built in. And Raiders or Venoms filled with Cabalite warriors are another staple. Nice enough objective skirmishers in their own right, but have the option of using Blade Storm for some fairly savage anti-infantry type shooting. They can just blast certain targets straight off the board. In general, Aeldari still seem to be really quite competitive, a very strong way to run the Aeldari faction. Leading the Space Elves behind, next up we have the Tyranids. The Bugs from Beyond the Galaxy have both ranged and melee options in their army, and really quite a whole host of bioforms. You can play the army as a sort of Nidzilla Carnifex Stomp, or go for an unending swarm of endless gaunts, gargoyles and other smaller organisms. They generally want to play as one singular organism, trying to attack and overwhelm the foe, with an emphasis on synapse range, with their bigger creatures guiding the smaller ones. And in particular, Games Workshop do seem to have leaned into them quite hard with the battle shot mechanics. Really quite a lot of options to deny enemy point scoring and score points yourselves in the index, potentially gaining a lot of victory points they'd otherwise struggle for. Their core army rule is Shadow in the Warp, a leadership debuff one where once in a command phase you can call the Shadow. Every enemy unit has to take Battle Shock, potentially with a -1 if there's an Eurotyrant around. Can be a bit random as to how much that actually does, but could be one mechanic that gives you the chance of getting some victory points at least. Otherwise, as mentioned, they have Synapse, with the units without it either having quite bad leadership outside the range but very, very good leadership within, as the greater organisms command them towards the enemy. and as they've got their codex, they've got quite a choice of different detachments, a fair few fairly playable ones in my opinion. Maybe Invasion Fleets being a particularly good one with the 5+ feel no pain stratagem it brings, plus the targeted damage boosts that help punish enemy skew lists. But other things like the Sneaky Vanguard Onslaught, the Unending Swarm with respawning Gaunts, and the Synaptic Nexus all can be interesting and strong in their own right. For a few strong Tyranids units, one of the major damage dealers they have are the Exocrines. Really quite a cheap walking Tyranid gun tank with a big bioplasma attack with good AP and damage 3, very nasty against enemy elite infantry in particular. Between that and the strength 10 psychic shots of the Maleceptor, they tend to often carry the Tyranids' core damage output. Gargoyles are pretty annoying flying chaff swarms. They move quickly and have objective control too. They don't really do all that much damage, but their move shoot move can allow them to get to board positions that they'd not otherwise be able to, and they can deep strike as well, so you could have them drop in front of the enemy and then get super close to do things like swoop in for objectives or move block. Recycling these guys in the unending swarm can be a really big move as well. The dreaded Death Leaper is a lone operative horror. He can't be shot at long range and is kind of hard to take down even if you get close. A good invulnerable save and fights first to scythe down a lot of enemy infantry before they get to strike can be big. Plus alongside things like Neurolictors, he can cause the enemy some big battle shock problems on objectives, forcing extra tests than they normally need to take and hopefully flipping them from their control to yours. Finally, the Neurotyrant is another fairly strong competitive staple, a surprisingly cheap Tyranid commander with a big bubble of synapse to command the horde. He gets a nasty psychic torrent attack that can fry enemy interlopers into your deployment zone, and he also amplifies the Shadow in the Warp as well, making everything -1 to test when that gets triggered, a lot more reliability there. Currently Tyranids are one of the armies that are on the lower end of the power spectrum, typically around the 45% win kind of mark, their main problem perhaps being just over-reliance on battle shock and scoring tricks with things like Biovores throwing spore mines everywhere, and just struggling with enough damage to really take down the core of the enemy army. Lots of their best damage dealers often tend to wound strength 10 on a 4+ or worse. They're still an army that can certainly be a struggle to overcome when played with the right player though. Moving on from the swarms to their cultist followers, we have the Genestealer Cults, the twisted mutant humans arising from the dregs of the hive to claw down the upper echelons and make way for Ascension Day. They play as basically 40k's guerrilla warfare army, mainly light infantry, bikes and transports, often with stat lines that are kind of maybe a bit mediocre for their points cost, but boosted by really quite powerful external rules, the ability to usually hit the enemy before they get to hit you, massive damage boosts, and often coming back for a second go in a seemingly unending horde. Generally their units might leave a mark and then not be too hard to deal with, but more likely waiting in the shadows. For their major army mechanic, most things can deep strike, arising from below and then receive damage buffs when they come in from reserve, hitting the enemy very hard on the turn that they come in with all manner of seismic cannons and demo charges. Then their Cult Ambush rule I think is one of the most interesting core mechanics of 40k. Basically, when you slay a Genestealer Cult unit that has this rule, they've got a good chance of being put back into reserve. You mark a token on the board, and then unless the opponent can move close to that token and get rid of it, the unit will arise there in their next reinforcement phase, potentially another wave of cultists to try and overwhelm the enemy later in the game. Can be kind of spooky, not knowing how many cultists you're going to have to destroy, and perhaps a bit swingy as well. Some units having the coin flip of whether or not they might come back or not could be truly quite game changing. Otherwise, for unit support, they've got some very powerful stratagems for big damage dealers, focusing fire with some buffs from characters stacked, and also things to hide a unit and return to reserve and drop very close to the enemy, lots of things to make their ambush even more spookier. Brood Brothers are also an option for the army, being able to field Astra Militarum units to throw them into the mix if they say wanted some basilisks for a little bit of quality indirect fire that can slow down and manipulate units. For a few key units for the faction, one of the primary damage dealers can actually be the Neophyte Hybrids. The lowly troops of the army can cart some fairly impressive mining weapons to the field, including the dreaded seismic cannons. With boosts from characters, other units and stratagems, they can hit very hard out of deep strike, and then when they're down, they're an enormous unit full of high objective control bodies that at least could have a good chance to swing an objective for a turn or so. Battle line things do have an increased chance to recycle as well. The hulking aberrant brutes are the big hitting damage dealers of the army, very expensive in points cost, but one of the terrifying things that they can do with a character and enhancement is infiltrate into the midboard, threatening absolutely massive damage on anything that they can catch, and they're very tanky and hard to kill as well. with high toughness, a -1 to wound, and good feel no pain. The Reductus Saboteur is a pretty interesting lone operative demo expert, very easy to kill if you can catch up with her, but if she can get a fairly maximal first strike, she can really make you pay for it, with a whole bunch of mortal wounds from her primary bombs, plus indirect explosives and a demo charge to throw at the enemy, lots of different ways to attack the foe. She can even get free grenade stratagems as well, as if that weren't enough. Finally, the Achilles Ridge Runner can be a pretty interesting AP synergy piece. These things can take mining lasers and things, though you can take mortars too, boosting AP at range by landing shells on the enemy, and then lighting up for your neophytes or acolytes with demo charges to bomb them into oblivion. Currently, Genestealer Cults aren't too far behind, but maybe a little bit weaker than some factions in 40k. Win rates are around about 46% and dropped a fair bit since the edition started. They do feel like an army where you do need to play them really quite carefully to be able to get good results, and even then you can still get punished with dice. There can be big swings as to whether or not certain units respawn, or whether the enemy can find some clever way to reach the target and scrub the ambush marker, and also disruptive charges from reserve can also be very hit or miss. For the forces of the greater good, we've got the Tau Empire. These technologically advanced Xenos are very much into their ranged combat and quite mobile with it as well, typically zipping around the board on relatively speedy battlesuits or tanks that can boast some good firepower on the move. Plenty of their mechanics rewarding getting up close a bit better to deal absolutely massive damage, though having to be a little bit wary of getting too close and personal too fast, as they've got little to no melee. And broadly speaking, the majority of their units aren't really all that tough to take out in returns, besides perhaps a few exceptions. The core Tau rule is for the greater good. This is their coordinated fire and marker-like kind of rules, units working in pairs with one observing for the guided units. The guided units getting better ballistic skill and to ignore cover if it's guided by a marker light, them incentivized to do big focus damage on that one enemy unit, as their other shots elsewhere will get worse. Generally you have to play around this if you want your units to have actually good damage, and several units can boost the guiding, such as stealth suits or Forge World Tetras. The somewhat recent Tau Codex has a fair few ways to play. Montcar, Kauyon, and Retaliation Cadre for the actual Tau armies will get onto the Kroot. Montcar for fast moving and big hitting damage early in the game. Kauyon for patiently waiting and keeping some force in reserve to really capitalise late game. And Retaliation Cadre for adventurous battlesuit forces, big damage up close. Another theme in the Tau Empire is drone wargear choices. Lots of units can take supporting drones that amplify them in different ways. Shield drones to add extra wounds, marker lights to help out with the whole guiding thing, and a few more exotic ones besides. For a few key units, I think it would be rude not to mention the army's archetypical crisis suits, the shock elite to the Tau descending from manta rays and hitting the enemy with special weapons. In the recent codex they split up the datasheets, and now they're really quite target locked. I feel like perhaps some of the most interesting and obvious are the Sunforge suits. Big hitting melter with rerolls, very nice if they manage to get close into melter range, as you can do with some investment in Retaliation Cadre. To try and take the midfield, Fire Warrior Breachers can be some of the main battle line. They're equipped with Strength 6 and AP1 Pulse Blasters with some really devastating firepower against things on objectives, getting to flat out reroll the wound roll, which is utterly savage. Devilfish can get them there in style. They've got plenty of good stratagems and might be joined by a Cadre Fireblades for yet more pulse shots. Stealth suits are a pretty key unit for marking targets. They're a cheap unit that can infiltrate into the midfield and certainly help with a bit of board control there. And any units that they happen to observe for can get to reroll ones to hit and wound, a really serious damage buff to be putting on some of the biggest and scariest units in the army. Their stealth fields can keep them just a little bit harder to kill, and they do have a touch of their own firepower with some burst cannons and fusion blasters as well. Finally, the Tau have many big scary guns with things like Skyrays, Hammerheads, or Broadsides, but one of the other big supersuits is the Riptide. This one's maybe not so much all about the damage. The Ion Accelerator's good against heavy infantry, though might struggle a bit against tough tanks and monsters. What it is good for, though, is being a slightly more durable unit than most for the Tau, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, and it really doesn't mind being on the front line and taking charges as much as most, as it gets to fall back and shoot, and is punished for getting in melee far less than most Tau units out there. Overall, the Tau haven't been having too bad a time of it in more recent 40k. They're pretty strong in game with around about 52% wins pre-codex. At time of recording we're still waiting for the official points cost for their units post-codex, though I feel like with a bunch of good detachments to choose from, they seem likely to still be in a good place. Returning to those Kroot mercenaries of Peg, I thought given their recent and quite extensive range release, they were worth focusing on their own right. Typically though, they'll operate as a stealthy scouting battle line with a lot of close range infantry killing, and tend to operate in concert with the Tower units, a sub-faction of the Tower Empire where if you took a mostly Kroot army you could take some Tower along, or vice versa. Games Workshop have given Kroot a detachment of their own in the Hunting Pack, where they've really tried to make a mostly Kroot army stand on its own 2 feet, really big support with 5+ invulnerable saves at range, and a fairly handy damage boost against injured units, probably not quite enough to overall make the faction particularly capable of taking down particularly tough enemy tanks and monsters, but enough that they should be able to badly threaten most medium toughness things. They do have some powerful stratagems for hiding units from sight and stopping them getting shot, or cycling big units of 20 strong carnivores, slaying units returning from the edges via strategic reserve. I do think that anti-tank is enough of a weakness though. You are probably going to want some dedicated anti-tank to shore that up. For a few key Kroot units though, we've got the Kroot Carnivores. They seem pretty top tier for Tower and Kroot alike. Sticky objectives is a great rule to have. They've got loads of objective control and are just cheap scouting infantry on top of that. Hard to go wrong with that combination even if they're not much of a threat to anything besides light infantry. The Kroot Lone Spear is probably worth having at least one of in a Kroot hunting pack. He's a lone operative that can deal a little bit of range damage and offers buffs for other Kroot if you target one unit. Potentially quite nice for helping to focus down one enemy threat, and you can take the Kroot Hawk Flock in the hunting pack, which makes him really quite an interesting lone operative for holding backfield objectives or just screening out enemy reserves in general. He does cost a lot, but just fast tanky lone operatives are kind of handy to have. Finally, I thought it was worth mentioning the main dedicated Tower melee unit out of any of them, the Krootox Rampagers. They're young and hot-blooded Krootox cavalry that can hit with a fairly fantastic amount of mid-strength, mid-damage attacks on the charge. Should be enough to maul most normal-sized units, and even be enough to threaten some heavier infantry, particularly if softened up or there's other buffs taking them down. They do have a whole ton of wounds on the board as well, could be enough to ensure that certain enemy units might think twice about charging a big squad of them. Overall, it'll be interesting to see whether or not people manage to make the Kroot hunting pack work competitively. It feels like you could have an awful lot of bodies on the table at -1 to hit and a 5+ invulnerable at range. Certainly a lot easier to kill for melee armies, but you're going to have a lot of presence on objectives, and you could still shore up your weaknesses against enemy tanks and vehicles with a few well-placed sky rays, broadsides, or Sunforged suits. Next up, and certainly hated by the Kroot, we have the fun-loving greenskins of the Orks, reveling in warfare and melee violence. Orks typically make war in great numbers, lots of stuff at the table, and generally excel at melee violence, their shooting being a bit inaccurate, hitting on a ballistic skill of 5+, so very vulnerable to modifiers and things. At least pre-Codex, Ork army lists generally tend to play with a whole load of melee pressure, surging up the board and then making good use of their war to hurtle them into combat. And within their army they have really quite a lot of army archetypes, can do hordes, mechanised armies, or dread mobs if desired, and plenty more. Their major faction rule is calling the war. The boss lets out a great battle cry, the Orks surge into combat on 1 turn, they get to advance and charge, they get +1 strength and +1 attack, which is a fantastically dangerous melee boost, and also they get a 5+ invulnerable save for the whole battle round as well, so are harder to kill in return. It's often best to call around turn 2ish, ideally when you might be maximally committing to melee violence against the enemy, but not too late in the game to make a huge difference. In the new Codex, the Orcs certainly got some fun stuff. They've got options for Green Tide, with big support for boys, extra durability and healing models. The Dread Mob helping out Orc Walkers and mech units, with some really quite big damage boosts and some fairly massive damage on certain Orky vehicles. The War Horde for some good and proper Orky Goth violence. Bully Boys for some scary knobs and mega knobs, with 2 turns of war for them, which sounds utterly terrifying. Cult of Speed for the buggies and bikers, and a big hunt to help out the beast snaggers. Will be interesting to see which of those rise to the top after the Orcs get their points costs revealed. I feel like the Bully Boys and the War Horde are probably still going to be some of the big contenders. Maybe Dread Mob and Green Tide could get a look in, depending on the exact cost of the units. If you do have just a general purpose Orc list though, then the War Horde is hard to go too far wrong with. Things like a +2 to charge strat is great, Headwhopper's Kill Chopper for a beast boss perhaps, and -1 to wound as a reactive stratagem is a really nice defensive buff. In general, Orc units tend to have big toughness and somewhat low saves, meaning that certain things are perhaps a little bit unexpectedly effective against them, while some things really fall flat. For a few key units, let's start with the boys. 85 points for a unit of 10 of these. That's really quite a lot of toughness 5 wounds to put on the table with good objective control, a whole flurry of attacks from their choppers, and work quite well with a war boss to lead them into battle, handing out some good and old-fashioned orky violence. Trucks are often one of the favoured orc transports, getting the lads to the front and giving them a good staging post to jump out of and charge. Pretty good for most flavours of greenskin melee, whether it's boys with bosses, knobs or mega knobs. While the lads hand out the violence, you can have some Gretchens sat at the back doing the boring stuff and scoring home objectives. They can rustle up some command points by looting the objectives, as just generally really cheap and expendable. It's a grot's life after all, they'll be sent to do the jobs that the orcs don't want to do. Screening units, holding down boring objectives, and clearing minefields no doubt. Finally, for some of the orky elites, we have the Mega Knobs, big and fighty orcs with snapping power claws and boosted shooters. They feel like they're going to be a very relevant unit in the Codex going forward. A 4+ feel no pain in the war is kind of massive, never mind the fact that they can get 2 turns worth of war in Bully Boys. You could have an entire scary orky Deathwing on the go, taking a massive amount of punishment and able to mete it out in return. Pre-Codex, the Orcs were in at least a reasonably good place, maybe a little bit on the lower mid-side of the 40k power spectrum, though definitely able to compete. Around about 47% wins pre-Codex, mainly using pressure melee units, though there certainly could be a few more viable builds making their way through now the Codex is out and about, and there are some very different ways to encourage different units out there. Next up, we've got the long-grudging space dwarves that are the Leagues of Votann, one of 40k's newest factions, reinterpreted from the squats of old. Their general playstyle is big hitting, somewhat short range damage output, quite a lot of close range firepower in particular, and they're particularly adept at destroying big tough enemy units with big defences, bringing a hammer blow down upon the enemy with their damage. A few of their units are somewhat slow moving and short range when they're on the board, they can compensate with that with a few vehicles and a fair few things that scout. One of the major drivers of all that damage is their judgment token mechanic, +1 to hit and perhaps also +1 to wounds against things that get marked by them. You can wind up with judgment tokens for destroying Votann units or being under the gaze of a Carl, but perhaps most powerfully and reliably at 2000 point games you get to mark 4 units for free with judgment tokens, each of them getting 2 tokens at the start of the game. It means that 4 of the enemy's biggest threats should be a lot easier to kill than otherwise. Besides that, they have a fair few fairly nice stratagems. Nice things like void armor to bounce shots off Ironhair Hearthguard or land fortresses, sustained hits when you're targeting judgment token things, and a few good enhancements as well, such as a long list. For some examples of their units, their bikers are generally handy to have in a list, fast moving scouts with some autocannon close range firepower. Just the sheer weight of shots they can put out can really threaten to end some threats early, particularly those with judgment tokens, can be a good way to potentially get some early kills in the game and get the command point reroll for satisfying their killer unit option. Another big damage dealer are the Sagitors, which are the Leagues of Votann dedicated transport, at least fairly robust with a toughness 10, meaning that you do need some proper anti-tank weapons to take them down, and they hit out with some twin bolt cannons and then some good anti-tank weapons on the back, either a high-las beam or some missiles. Scouting can get you some good lines of sight, and they can deliver other things to deal damage as well, maybe some Chthonian berserks to melee, or Hearthkin warriors to get out onto objectives. Ironhair Hearthguard are perhaps one of the big hitting damage dealers of the faction. They might look like Votann Terminators, but their damage is a lot more balanced between range and melee. Massive volume fire that can have some big effects when they've got +1 to hit and wound on the go. Lots of Vulcanite shots that can fish away for mortal wounds as well. They're certainly a competitive staple unit, led by either an Ironhair champion or a Carl, and are one of the best focal options for stratagems like void armor or things that boost damage. Finally, perhaps the core HQ choice for the Leagues of Votann is the Carl. He's just a generally good leader, a fair bit of melee to add to the unit, he has lethal hits to his squad, which can really help stack the enemy with loads of saves with a unit like Ironhair Hearthguard, and he can hand out judgment tokens in the command phase as well, making enemy units progressively easier to kill if he can stay on the board in line of sight. For Ironhair Hearthguard, he'd have to weigh up against the hard-hitting Ironhair champion. Overall, broadly speaking, the kin seem to be in a pretty good place at the moment, a middling sort of win rate at around about 49%, the majority of their index quite usable, though maybe things like Chthonian berserks and the standard Hearthkin could perhaps use a little more help. Will be interesting to see what other releases they inevitably get for 10th edition. They don't have all that many options in their unit roster right now. Finally, for our look through the armies, we come to the enigmatic and ancient Necrons. and these soulless horrors arising from their tomb world generally tend to be pretty tanky and dangerous, having had such a big expansion of their unit roster in the Indomitus launch in 9th edition that they can now do most battlefield roles at least fairly well. Options for somewhat hoardy infantry, both ranged and melee specialists, including long range and close range firepower. Perhaps the most common theme is a fair few tricks for reanimation and durability options. Often some of the strongest units for the Necrons tend to be the toughest ones. Previously Lichguard or warriors at the start of the edition, now Khitanan race may be particularly coming to the fore. Their core rule is reanimation protocols. In your command phase you get to roll a d3 and restore that many wounds to the unit, reanimating models from the grave, standing them back up if you need to. It can be quite disruptive for enemy firepower, as you can't just do chip damage to units, as the enemy will just slowly regrow it. It means that you have to be disciplined with the shooting output, hopefully destroy an entire unit outright, as opposed to damaging multiple small things, and sometimes that's not always the most easy or convenient thing to do. With their codex they've got a few fun ways to play. Canoptek Court and Hypercrypt tend to be their most strong detachments. Canoptek Court is all focused around Cryptex and Wraiths, big rerolls when he can maintain the power matrix, and often lots of Wraiths bullying the midfield, and Doomstalkers heading up the backfield for some massive firepower from afar. Reactive moves and hiding units from shooting can be really disruptive while they do that. Hypercrypt Necrons can allow them to warp round the board, maybe getting scary damage dealers up close and having interesting movement tricks with Chronomancers, and there's plenty of others such as the Balanced Awakened Dynasty with the command protocols, Obeisance Phalanx with the Lichguard, and Annihilation Legion which goes all out to support these Scorpec destroyers. For a few key Necron units, the Immortals often tend to be one of the units that a lot of HQs like to run alongside. Spam's Tesla Fire is quite popular for lots of saves stacked on enemy units, particularly those that dare to be on an objective. They can be very scary alongside Illuminor Seraz as well, helping them out both in terms of damage and defense with his Cryptek skills and manipulating AP. The Khitanan Shards are some of the scariest models in Warhammer 40k right now. They're probably going to get toned down in a future balance update, but currently they just have kind of godly durability and damage output for their points cost, huge invulnerable saves, massive feel no pain and damage mitigation, and the Nightbringer and the Void Dragon will be able to go through a whole load of threats with enormous damage on their melee. They really like the Hypercrypts to warp them closer to the enemy as well. The Canoptek Wraiths have also been one of the standout units since the Necron Codex came out, just enormously tanky with a Technomancer in tow, big invulnerable saves, a 5+ feel no pain, restoring wounds all over the place, and at least enough ranged and melee threats to bully some lighter units out there just through sheer volume of attacks. They're particularly scary in Canoptek Court with the rerolls, and even more so for a unit that can infiltrate into the midboard, threatening a first turn charge. Finally, for just one example of the many flavours of Necron long-range heavy firepower are the Locust Heavy Destroyers, fairly cheap models as they go, each sporting an enormous damage 6 Gauss gun with rerolls built in. Certainly a unit that if they're on the table, any enemy heavies just can't really relax until they're dealt with. Any failed save against these guys could cause enormous damage, and they quite like Hypercrypt as well, being able to warp round the board and get a focus bead on their prey. At time of recording, the Necrons are perhaps the single strongest army in Warhammer 40k, winning more tournaments than any other faction and around about 57% wins. It seems they're currently the faction to beat, carried in no small part by the strength of those Khitanan out there. It might not be great news for them, as they might attract some negative attention in another balanced data slate at some stage though. As mentioned, I can't help but think that the Khitanan are probably going to get points increases, and really soon. In any case though, that's the end of this particular Odyssey. Just having a quick talk through the major game mechanics of every single faction in Warhammer 40k can take a bit of time these days. Let me know your thoughts on the armies, which are the ones that you enjoy playing with or against, which have got the coolest mechanics, and which ones could do with something better to help them out. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.